Okay, so yesterday we discussed the incompact code and the open source database by John Hopkins. So, uh, I'm assuming that you know how to get the data. Now that you can get your data, all you have to do is define your problem and work on it. So today's lecture would be towards that. So I'll introduce a few research areas. One of them being my own, and show you how people approach those research problems and how you can use the databases and the open source code to proceed further. Okay, we'll start by discussing the research area that I'm working on. Okay, so I'll begin with that. Okay, so this paper is called Hierarchy of Coherent Structures and Real Space Energy Transfer in a Turbulent Channel Flow. Okay, so the problem here is uh, the research problem that is being addressed is the energy transfer. Okay, so if you remember, I had told you about the scales that are present in the flow, and the turbulent energy is produced at the large scales and dissipated at small scales. Okay, so there is an energy transfer from these large scales to smaller ones. To smaller ones. Okay. So this paper actually studies this energy transfer from the large to smaller ones, and this research area is not something new. It has been done. It is being done for a long time. So this all started with Kolmogorov's or even Richardson's work, so which is even older than Kolmogorov's thing. But the studying the energy transfer in real spaces. So what I mean by real spaces, the energy transfer from large to small scales was done in spectral space. So if you remember the Navier-Stokes equation in spectral space, and if you multiply this equation with the velocity u itself, you'll get an energy equation. Okay. Now again, if you decompose into mean and turbulent, you'll see that there is an energy transfer happening from mean to turbulent energy, which is the which is essentially the production of turbulent kinetic energy. Okay. However, uh, let me use good notes itself. Okay. So what I'm saying is there is energy production at large scales, and this energy is being dissipated at small scales. Okay. And dissipation. So you know there is this relation between them, and this was studied in spectral space mostly. So we have our Navier-Stokes equation in the spectral domain. I guess this was it. Okay, if you multiply this equation with u prime again, you'll get an equation for energy. Okay, you'll get an equation for energy which has a transfer function to it. Oh no! Before you get the energy equation, you apply a filter to this velocity field. So if you um, apply a filter to this velocity field, you're basically decomposing this velocity field into uh, a large scale velocity field and a small scale velocity field. So Let's say you have applied this filter at scale R. So there will be some energy within the um, so this was the spectra. So these are the large scales and these are the smaller ones. So when you decompose your spectral velocity into the large and small scales, you know that there is uh, energy. There will be some energy transfer from these large scales to smaller ones. So earlier, all these energy transfer studies were done in spectral space. Okay, but uh, this paper and several others which have come up more recently, they do it in real space. That is, they quantify the energy transfer in the spatial domain XYZ itself instead of the wave number domain. Okay, so they study energy transfer in real space and they do it for a turbulent channel flow. So energy transfer, when we talk about energy transfer, we people mostly deal with the inertial scales, inertial range and dissipation range scales. So if you remember, we had talked about the universal equilibrium range, the inertial range, and so this is the spectra. There is something called the universal equilibrium range, and in between you have the inertial subrange. And this one is called the dissipation range. Earlier cascade studies. So instead of energy transfer, I'll say cascade now because that's what the terminology is in turbulence. So the earlier energy cascade studies were done for isotropic, homogeneous and isotropic turbulence. So what they did is they simulated this homogeneous and isotropic turbulence in a simple cubical domain, and they studied the energy transfer from inertial scales to the dissipation scales, where the statistics are assumed to be in homogeneous and isotropic. However, this study, it studies the energy transfer for a turbulent channel flow. Okay, and it also talks about the hierarchy of coherent structures. These are relevant because these are the entities which actually cause the energy transfer from large to smaller scales. Or when we say scales or eddies, these are what we call coherent structures as well. So coherent structures are actually the eddy motions or extended regions where you see some coherence. So they are in one way or another related to the eddying motions that are present in the turbulent flows. So that's what the research problem is. Okay, so how do they go about doing this? So this is a computational work. So what they have done is they have performed channel flow simulations. They have done turbulent channel flow simulations at a Reynolds number of 4,179. Okay, and what they do is they actually extract these coherent structures or these eddying motions. So once you have done your direct numerical simulations, you have your velocity field. You have ux, y, and z. This ux, y, z has a certain spectra. Okay, has certain energy spectra. So what this study does is it uses band pass filters to isolate eddies of some particular scale. Okay, so what band pass filters? So if I filter it here using a low pass filter, I have only these smaller scales, larger scales left. That is small wave numbers left, and these filters will be damped out. Okay, so let me draw what a gain function for a low pass filter would look like. So it will look something like this. So it will allow all the low wave numbers, and it will filter out the higher wave numbers. However, if you for a high pass, it will look like this. So the high pass would allow only the high wave numbers, and a band pass would have a shape like this. So it will allow the frequencies that are there in a band. Okay, so what a band pass filter does, it isolates the content, the spectral content from a given wave number. Okay, so in this method they use a band pass filter. I'll represent the band pass filtering procedure using B, or yeah. So the band pass filter this velocity field, and once you have band pass filtered it, you'll get some velocity field UB. From this UV, what they do is they calculate vorticities, entropy. Entropy is nothing but vorticity square, and they plot their isosurfaces. Okay, you can also plot velocity isosurfaces. So there are several kinds of coherent structures in a flow. Okay, so let's see what they have looked at. So there are, large scale vortices or large scale coherent structures. Uh, and they can be, large vertical motions. So we have large scale coherent structures. These can be, you know um, horseshoe vortex like structure. These can be streaks. So what a horseshoe vortex is, say if you have a boundary layer, so you'll see that at the edge of the boundary layer it has a wrinkled surface. So this, so at the edge of this thing, I mean, there have been studies which have shown that there are, vertical motions present at this thing, and they're shaped like a horseshoe. So this is their general shape. So if I draw the flat plate here, the flow is in this direction, so they will have a vertical motion like this. Okay, so this is the vertical motion. So these are, you know, the size, their sizes are comparable to either the boundary layer thickness or channel half height. So these are large scale coherent structures present in the flow, and there are also stream-wise streaks present in the flow. So what these streaks are, they are, so if you look at the plate, flat plate from the top, you'll see long regions of um, high speed and low speed flow fluctuations. So you'll see regions where the flow speed is low, and adjacent to it there are regions where the flow speed is higher. So you'll see these in alternating patterns. Okay, and they're not usually the straight. They usually meander. So there are undulations like this in these streaks. So these are meandering streaks that are present in the flow. So these are some examples of the large scale structures. The small scale structures are, they are in the shape of hairpin vortices. They are present mostly in the log region of the flow. Hairpin vortices are again, they're shaped like hairpins. So they have long legs, and they have a head which actually rises from the wall. So if this is the wall, these legs are closer to the wall and their head is lifted away from the wall, and they also have a vertical motion to it. So there are these hairpin vortices as well. Okay, so they identify these large scale and small scale structures for various for various scales of the bandpass filter they have used. Okay. So here they describe the bandpass filtering procedure that they have used. Okay. So uh, so this expression here is the low pass filtering procedure. So they are filtering all the content that are higher than scale sigma. Okay, so you are this is a spectra. You are filtering everything that is higher than scale sigma. From this, they define a band pass filter. Okay, so the band pass filtered velocity field they have evaluated as a difference of two low pass filtered velocity fields. Okay, so there is a velocity field which has filtered everything from higher than sigma, and then there is another velocity field which has filtered everything from 2 sigma. Okay, so if you take a difference of these two, you'll have this velocity field. You'll be left with this one. Okay, so that's how they get the bandpass filtered velocity field. And so once you bandpass filter, it has contributions only from a particular scale. So with this definition of the bandpass filtered field, they have given some metrics of these bandpass filters. So they say that if you use this definition, your resultant velocity field that you get, it will the prominent scale will be centered around root 2 sigma or 1.5 times the sigma that you have used. Okay, so once you get the filtered velocities, you can use those. I mean, you can plot isosurfaces to detect those structures. You can calculate vortices and plot isosurfaces of those vortices or entropy values to get these structures as several scales. So if you look at figure 2 here, your 2A is filtered at sigma of 960. So this is a large scale that so these are the large scale structures that they have filtered out. Figure B is filtered at sigma of 240. So these are smaller than the first ones, and C is filtered at 60. Uh, and please note that these scales are normalized using volumes. Okay, so 60 is essentially 240 and 60 are scales that might be present in the log region in this case. So you see, these filters are they've demonstrated that these filters are capable of extracting these structures at several scales. Then they have studied the geometry of these structures. So they have seen that the large scale structures, how the large scale structures are, uh, you know, uh, shaped. So what they've shown here is there must be an average one. Yeah. So this is an average large scale structure. So this shows. Okay, so these blue and green curves are basically vertical motions. So one of these, if you say one of these is positive, the other one would be a negative vertical motion. Okay, so if this vertical motion is like this, the yellow one would be like this. The blue region in between them is a streaky structure which can be a low speed streak or a high speed streak. So if your vertical motions are like this might be a high speed streak, and if they are if the vertical motions are like this, then this would be a low speed streak. Okay, why this is so is because these vertical motions, because of a velocity field induced by them, they actually lift up the low speed fluid that is closer to the wall, away from the wall. So away from the wall, you get a region of low speed flow. Okay, and if you reverse the vertical signs, the opposite would be true. Okay, so they have looked at the hierarchy of these structures that are present. So how the large scales are shaped, how the smaller scales are shaped, and yeah, so the smaller scales they have shown that if you take an average of these, they are spherical in size. So plot A to C. So plot A to C, the A, B, and C are sigma plus 60 structures at three heights. Okay, so this is essentially a small structure, but at three different wall locations, and they are more or less uh, spherical. So what this shows is that the small scales are isotropically oriented. So if you take an average of it, it will get spherical in nature. As you go closer to the wall, this isotropy is lost, because close to the wall there the presence of wall is felt, and it is the isotropy is no longer there. So there is a directional preference now. You see, closer to the wall, the average vertical structure is being stretched. Okay, so mm, that was the shape and size of structures that are present in the flow. Next, what they have done is, okay, so like I said, you can, when you filter your velocity field. Okay, let me. So if you remember, in a turbulence lecture, we had decomposed the instantaneous flow into mean and fluctuating flow, and we wrote an equation for the mean momentum equation. But you can also multiply the mean momentum equation and get the turbulent kinetic energy equation. Get the kinetic energy equation for mean and momentum flow, mean and fluctuating flow. If you do so, you'll see that there is a production term, which is minus uv, correlation of minus uv del u by del y. This is capital U. So this entire term is positive. So this appears as a sink term in the equation for mean kinetic energy equation, and it appears as a source in the fluctuating kinetic energy equation. Okay, so this basically represents the turbulence energy that is being produced by the mean shear. So del u by del y is basically the mean shear that is present in the flow. Okay, and this is the Reynolds stress. So this quantity basically represents the turbulence energy produced, or the production by Reynolds stress and the mean shear in the flow. Okay, likewise, so in analogy to this, if you, let's say, if you decompose your velocity field by, let's say, using a low pass filter into a low pass filtered, or large scale flow field and small scale flow field. In analogy to this, you'll get a transfer term which quantifies the transfer of energy from large to small scales. Okay. Uh, if you want to look at an expression for this, it will be there in. So let's look at the energy first. Okay, so this here is the kinetic energy equation that I was talking about. So this is the kinetic energy equation for the fluctuating part, and Here is the production term. Okay, so this is called the production of K, kinetic energy by the mean flow. Now, if you use filtered velocity fields, so if you filter your velocity field into large and small scales, okay, you filtered it into large and small scale, and if you write the kinetic energy for small scales, you'll see. So this term here is, this is not transfer term. This is the production term at small scales by mean flow. The transfer is happening because of this one. This is the transfer term. Okay, so the transfer term has, you know, it looks like this. So it has a structure similar to production. Now, if you were to interpret this thing, you can say that this is the turbulence energy being produced at small scales because of the shear induced by larger scales, and you subtract the contribution. I mean, subtract the contribution that is in the reverse direction, which is, the turbulence energy being produced at larger scales because of the shear produced by the smaller scales. So, did you get this part? I mean, did you understand this part so far?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So this here quantifies the transfer of energy from large to smaller scales. Okay. So this is, this and this these expressions are for, low pass filtered velocity fields. However, you can use similar expressions. You will get similar expressions for, band pass filtered velocity fields as well. So what this paper has done is it has quantified this transfer of energy from one scale to another using this expression. So, like I said, what energy cascade says is your energy is being transferred from large scales to smaller ones. Okay, so you have a hierarchy of structures from large to smaller ones. Uh, the theory says that these scales they interact among themselves, and they transfer energy subsequently from these larger to smaller scales. Okay, so that's what using the analysis that I had shown in that paper, you can actually quantify the energy that is being transferred from, let's say, this large scale to this small scale. So all you have to do is band pass filter it at these scales. So you'll have this ul band pass filtered, and us band pass filtered, and then you can use that, sorry, you can use the transfer expression, which was usps. Okay, so you can use this expression and get a value for energy that is being transferred here. Okay, so before I show you the results, I'll also mention that there is an assumption of locality of scale interactions in the cascade theory. So what this assumption says that, uh, if you, let's say, this scale, the assumption of locality of scale interactions is that this scale will interact with scales that are local to this one. That is, it cannot interact with very large or very small scales directly. It has to interact through them through the neighboring scales itself. So that is the assumption of locality of scale interaction. And as a consequence of this scale interaction, this assumption, there is essentially a disconnect between the largest and the smallest scales. So if you remember Kolmogorov's assumptions, so it said that the small scale statistics are isotropic. That is, there is no directional preference there. However, there can be directional preference at large scales. So what happens is, let's say if these are your large scales, inertial range and your dissipation range. So what this assumption of locality says that yes, any given scale cannot directly interact with a scale very smaller than this one, very smaller than itself. It has to interact. The only way of interacting with the smallest scales would be through this cascading size, this range of scales. So basically, the small scales are, they are not under the influence of larger scales where anisotropy is present, and as a result, they said that the small scales would be isotropy. Okay, so that was just a side note. Do not have to get confused. Okay, so okay, so this is the transfer of energy from large to smaller scales. Okay, let's see what they have done now. Yeah. Okay, so here they have plotted the that transfer of from large to smaller scales for several values of. Okay, so now they have used sigma 2 and sigma from. So sigma from is okay. So the transfer is happening from sigma from to sigma 2. Okay, so this is basically the large scale now. This is the small scale now. Okay, so let's look at the figure 1, figure A. So figure A is at 960. That's the wall normal location. Okay, so we have to look at these symbols. So the circular symbols are for sigma 2 of 30, square is for 60, 120 and 240. Okay, so the circular symbols were for 30. So the circle is for 30. So let's look at this plot. We see that the energy transfer from, so the x-axis is sigma from. So the energy transfer from scales of size 30 to scales of size 30 is 0. I mean, of course, you cannot transfer energy to yourself. This one, so this point says, so the energy transfer from scales of size 60 can, again, these sizes are normalized using wall units or viscous units. If you don't know what viscous units is, you have your velocity scale u tau, which is square root of tau wall by rho. Okay, and the length scale is nu by u tau. Okay, so you can normalize your quantities using these two things. So these length scales are being normalized by wall scales. Okay, so yeah, so the energy transferred from structures of size 60 to size 30 is here. So we see there is some positive energy transfer. 120 to 30, again there is some energy transfer but lower than what we saw earlier, and so on. Okay, and here squares were sigma 2 of 60. Okay, so for sigma 2 we see uh, so energy transfer from structures of size 30 to 60. So this is basically energy being transferred from structures of size 30 to size 60. As we know, the energy should be transferred on average from large to smaller scales, and this scale is obviously larger than this one. So that's why we see a negative value here. Again, the transfer from 60 to 60 would be 0, and the transfer from 120 to 60 is some positive value, which again decreases as we go up in scale. We'll see similar plots for the other scales. So again, negative values for transfer of energy from small scales to larger ones, 0. So 120 to 120 is 0. It peaks at energy transfer for sigma 240 to 120. Okay, so you see similar plots for other wall locations as well. So this was a wall location of 960. Again, 960, it's because it's normalized by wall units. So there are two other wall locations of 240 and 60. So there also you see similar plots here. Okay. So they have basically quantified the interscale energy transfer. And what they saw is the interscale energy transfer peaks uh, when your large scale is twice the size of smaller scale. That's when your transfer of energy peaks and it drops subsequently. Okay, so this actually comes in support of that locality assumption. That is, you can interact with scales that are local in size, that are local to you. So a size of scale L, or let's say in the spectra, a size of scale L can interact with a smaller scale of size L by 2, a larger scale of size 2L, but it cannot interact with, let's say, something uh, very small like L by 100 or something. I mean, there might be some interaction, but it's very close to zero. Okay, so these observations, they actually support the assumptions of locality. Okay, so is this clear, the problem with the paper?
Yeah, this part is clear.
So which one is not clear?
एक्चुअली मेरे को
Hmm.
लाइक ऑल इन ऑल क्या हो रहा है ये सब तो समझ आ रहा है,
हाँ.
बट काफ़ी सारी इक्वेशंस हैं, कुछ वेरिएबल्स वगैरह हैं जिनमें थोड़ा बहुत उनकी वैल्यूज, लाइक जो हमने फिल्टर लगाया उसकी कोई इक्वेशन थी,
हाँ.
गॉसियन फिल्टर लगाया, वो कुछ पता नहीं चला।
ओके ओके ओके, समझ गया मैं, उसमें मैं गुस्सा भी नहीं था. सो सॉरी,
हाँ
I reverted back to Hindi. I shouldn't have done that. I mean, but we shouldn't. I should have described the equation as well, the filtering equation. I mean, okay. So this is basically a Gaussian filter being applied on you. Okay, so you have your velocity field, and then you apply a Gaussian filter of some scale sigma, and this is a convolution integral here, x minus x prime, integrated with x prime, and this also is x prime. So this filter is similar to what I had shown you earlier uh, when I talked about LES, if you remember. Okay, let me do this. So you have your velocity field ux. You can filter this using a convolution integral, uh, or a filter function g. Okay, then you'll get a filtered velocity. This would also be a function of L. You'll have some filter scale L. Okay, so what this is doing basically, your G could be anything. So I can define it to be something like this. So this is defined with x minus r. So let's say we are at x here. For r equals to 0, this coordinate is r now. Okay, so x minus r would be negative and x plus r would be positive. I mean, what I'm trying to say is this coordinate is centered at x, and I can define this filter function to be, square wave like this. Okay, and let's say I have my signal here. Okay, so what when you multiply these two, what it will do is this filter will select out only this part of the signal. So it will select out only this one. Okay, and the rest it will drop to 0. And then when you perform this integral, what it will do is it will take an average of all these velocities and replace the velocity at x. So your velocity at x was this was your ux, but now it will be replaced by an average of this thing. So now it's a filtered velocity ux. Okay, so that's how this convolution integral works. So it has basically filtered out these fluctuations. It is basically taking an average. Okay, is this clear?
Yes.
So now instead of a square pulse, if I take a, you know, a Gaussian pulse, so this is again centered here. Okay, and if you remember, the Gaussian pulse had a scale sigma. So this sigma is there, right? So what would happen if we use a smaller value of sigma? So you have e to the power, uh, let's say x square, and you have e to the power minus 2x square. How would they be shaped? Your ex square is something like this. Yet negative 2 times x square will decay faster, right?
Yes.
So in your exponential function, the coefficient of x square, if it has a larger value, it will decay faster. So there it was 1 by sigma square. If you have a larger sigma, which means you have a smaller this coefficient, so a larger sigma would decay slower. So let's say this is sigma 1. Let's we take larger sigma 2, so that will decay very slow. This is sigma 2. Okay, and sigma 2 is larger than sigma 1. So what would be the effect of using sigma 2? This will average over a larger window, right?
Yeah.
And this will average over a smaller window. So your larger scale filter is actually averaging over larger scales. So it is filtering out all these fluctuations over this scale. And your smaller sigma 1 will filter out only over this scale. Okay? So any fluctuations which are larger than this scale, smaller than this scale is filtered out. Any fluctuations which are smaller than this scale is filtered out for this one. So that's how this filter works. But how do you, I hope this is clear how this is working.
Yeah. Yeah.
But how do you, apply this filter in while using your computations? Well, convolution integrals are difficult to evaluate. So what we do is we take Fourier transforms. Okay. So let's say you have fx, you have another function gx, or a gr minus x. This is a convolution integral. Now Fourier transform of fx is fkx. Let's say fkx. This would be gkx. Fourier transform. This is the Fourier transform of. Uh, sorry. Okay. Let's say the Fourier transform of fx is f hat k, and your Fourier transform of gr minus x would be g hat k. This is your integral that you want to evaluate. Now, if you take the Fourier transform of I, it would be a product of these two Fourier transforms. Okay, you can go back and check this one. The Fourier transform of a convolution integral is basically the product of two individual Fourier transforms of the functions that are being convolved. Okay, so how do we evaluate? We take the Fourier transform of these two functions independently, we multiply them, and then we take an inverse Fourier transform to get I. That's how we apply filters. Okay, I'll show you how this filter works in the Fourier space as well. So you have your spectra. Okay, if you remember, this is a log scale. Even this is a log scale. Now, the Fourier transform of a Gaussian would be a Gaussian. Okay, so this is Gaussian in space. You take a Fourier transform, you'll get a Gaussian in K. Okay, now if I plot this in a log scale, it will be something like this. It will drop to 0, but it will have shape like this. So this is basically filtering out all these high frequency fluctuations out. Okay, how a band pass filter function would work is it will have a function like this in Fourier space. So if this is your spectra, it will be shaped like this. So it will keep only these fluctuations. These are filtered out. If you want to see at a sample band pass filter of what it looks like, I'll show you in Fourier space. Okay, so this is, you see this equation is band pass filtering in Fourier space. You have your Fourier transform of velocity field, then you have this function which is being multiplied to that, and you get the band pass filtered Fourier transform of your band pass filtered velocity field. So if you look at this, it has kappa square exponential negative kappa square. So how would this be shaped in the wave number domain? Let's take linear wave number right now. So it was kappa square exponential negative kappa square. So your negative kappa square is, it goes from, it's 1 at kappa equal to 0, goes to 0 at infinity. Your this function is, it goes like this. So a product of these two would be something like this. Okay, on a log scale it would be something like this. Maybe a sharp drop here. So this is a band pass filter. I hope this is clear, the band pass filtering thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So the band pass filter that I am using is this one described in the paper by Doan, Swaminathan, and Davidson. The one that I had described earlier, that is a different kind of band pass filter. Okay. So I can share with you the code for this band pass filtering scheme if you wish to. Okay, let's go back to that paper now. If you have anything else to ask, you can ask.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Okay, so they have also looked at other stuff as well. They have looked at entropy, omega square. So if you can derive, I mean, from your Navier-Stokes equation, your Navier-Stokes equation is for U, right? You have du by dt is minus, sorry, it's negative of grad p plus mu del square u. If you take a curl of this equation, del cross u, you'll get a vorticity equation. Okay, I think d omega by dt is u dot del omega plus, I guess, nu omega square is there. Yeah, I think it was this one. Okay, you'll get some vorticity equation, and from this you can derive the entropy equation as well. So for this also you'll get some analogous term. Entropy generation term is there, and you can look at entropy as well. People look at entropy because there is, people believe that the energy transfer from large scales to small scales happen because of vortex stretching. So what they say is that you have a vertical motion like this, and because of the shear in the flow, these vortices get stretched out. So if you stretch this out, okay, so the vortices get stretched out because of the shear in the flow, and since when they are stretched out because of the conservation of angular momentum property, your vorticity increases. So the omega for this one was smaller, and for this one it is larger. And what happened while the vortex was stretching is the scale for this one was L, or L1, and the scale for this one is L2. So the vortex that was L1 earlier is L2 now, and L1 is greater than L2. So basically, the energy that was at a larger scale earlier is now at a smaller scale. So that's how they say that the energy transfer happens, and people have checked this one as well. Like uh, what people do is they check the alignment statistics of it. I don't know if they have done this or not. They have probably not done it. It's in a different paper. Okay, so they have done a lot more analysis than what I've told you. You can go through this in detail and try to do some of it yourselves, or at least make a presentation of what they have done, what you have tried to do yourselves, and if you could replicate some of their results, then that would be nice. Okay, so uh, I think we can stop with this paper, right? If you have any questions, you can.
No.
Okay, so the other paper that I wanted to discuss is this one. So it's again related to, somehow related to energy cascade itself, but it addresses the scaling of dissipation. So okay, what this means is, like I've told about the energy cascade. Uh, your energy is being dissipated at small scales, right? And your dissipation is, well, the expression for this is 2 times mu Sij. Mm, so what this paper is trying to do is, uh, oh, I'm sorry. See this expression. Uh, so it says, so it's about this expression here. Okay, I'll explain it better. So your energy is being produced at large scales, and through scaling analysis, people have said that okay, it is of the order of U cube by L. Okay, why U cube by L? Because the production is minus U prime V prime del U by del Y. Okay, so U prime V prime, they are all of the order of U. The Y would be of the order of L. So this is dimensionally, this would be of the order of U cube by L. And the dissipation, so the all the energy being produced is transferred through the inertial sub range to dissipation scales, where the energy that was produced is dissipated. Okay, so it's being dissipated at small scales, and your production is basically equal to dissipation. So your dissipation would be proportional to U cube by L. So that's what they are trying to see here. So so what they have said is, okay, let's say that my dissipation is C times U prime Q by L. Now, as per this theory, your C should be a constant. Okay. Now this is constant for high Reynolds number flows. So when you have enough scale separation between the low and small and large scales, this equation holds. But at lower Reynolds numbers, we see that there is some Reynolds number dependence on this thing. So that is what they have looked at. That is what they have quantified. Okay. So how they have done this? So they have used both experimental and numerical data for this. They have used hot wire anemometry and direct numerical simulations. Okay. Also, they have done their studies on the outer layer of a turbulent boundary layer. Okay, so they have a turbulent boundary layer. They have done their studies somewhere in the outer region, assuming that this is isotropic in or the anisotropy here is very small. So that is their assumption, which is not exactly true. So they have assumed local isotropy and homogeneity at small scales away from the wall. Okay, so the first thing that they have done, they again they have used what they have used the incompact code to get the data. Okay. Hmm. So this is the these are the this is the CF value for the boundary layer simulations that they have done. So the CF value basically increases. So there is transition happening, and then you have your turbulent part here. Okay. Now they have calculated the dissipation using the actual expression which you use to calculate the dissipation in flows. So this is the true dissipation, and then if you use assumptions of homogeneity, you get this expression. Further, if you use the assumption of isotropy, you will get this expression. So what they've done is they have calculated all three and they've plotted it here to check whether their assumption holds or not. Okay, so this shows that the assumption of homogeneity does not affect much here. Okay. However, the assumptions of isotropy only affect the statistics which are close to the wall. Away from the wall, they are more or less same. I mean, that is what it seems from the this plot. If you look at this one, which is the ratio of the isotropic dissipation and the complete dissipation, although they have reached a plateau here in this region, we see that the isotropic dissipation formula only accounts for 80% of the actual dissipation. Okay, so I mean their assumptions, I mean they can go ahead with it. They have actually, but they are. It's not right. Right in a strict sense to assume that to assume small scales isotropy here. But still, it's good enough to go. However, there can be improvements made on this study. You can take something that is actually isotropic. The reason that they are doing turbulent boundary layer simulations is because they also want to compare it to the experimental data that they have for a boundary layer. Okay, so these are their experimental plots, and they are comparing it to the DNS here. Okay, so these are the mean flow plots, RMS. Somehow their RMS plots for DNS shows a higher RMS for wall locations closer to the wall. So on to the results. Okay, so they have plotted all these things for the DNS and the experimental plots as well. So I think these are for the experimental data, and this here is for DNS. So for the experimental data, they have plotted the Kolmogorov length scale, the Taylor's microscale. This is something that I have not told you about, but this is a scale that is derived from autocorrelation curves. Uh, Reynolds number based on lambda. Okay, I think I should tell you about lambda and R lambda. Okay, so lambda, that is Taylor's microscale. This is obtained from the autocorrelation curves for you. So if you plot the autocorrelation curve, if you remember what autocorrelation curve was, it's u prime x, u prime x plus r by square. Okay, so this is 1 when r is 0, and it drops, it has some functional form, and it drops to 0 as r increases. Now if you fit a parabola at the vertex of this plot, so let's fit a parabola here. The intercept of the parabola on this axis is lambda. It's called the Taylor's microscale. And when you define a Reynolds number based on this microscale, it's called the Reynolds number based on Taylor's microscale. Okay. So they have plotted the dependence of Kolmogorov's length scale, Taylor's microscale, the Reynolds number based on that, the integral length scales as well. Okay, the dissipation and the constant that they are trying to look at. They have plotted all of this as function of wall normal locations. Okay, so if you remember, close to the wall normal location, their assumptions of homogeneity and isotropy was not satisfied. Okay, so they see that there is a functional dependence between epsilon and y. Okay, why is there not? Hmm. Okay, so what they observed is, okay, they have plotted the dependence of that constant with Re lambda. This they have obtained by using this. So at each wall normal locations, your Re lambda is different and C epsilon is different. So using these two plots, they have plotted C epsilon as a function of Re lambda. And what they observe is, for low values of Reynolds numbers, there is this functional dependence on uh, Re lambda. Okay, so this dependency is there. Okay, while for higher values of Re lambda, the C epsilon is a constant, which actually, uh, you know, which is what we actually expect. Okay, so that's that. This is what the study was. And, however, there is scope for improvements in these three. Okay, so they have concluded in this manner. So for low Re lambda, they saw that this functional dependence on Reynolds number was there. Uh, they have suggested a scaling for the constant here at low values of Re lambda. Okay, how they've said that, they've also pointed out that the assumptions of isotropy are not satisfied in a strict manner. Okay, so they have said that while our results suggest some form of non-equilibrium turbulence, trends reported previously are not contaminated by homogeneities and isotropy of flow. Further studies are needed to address conclusively the presence of such cascades. Okay, so what they say that, okay, there is scope for improvement in their studies. Anyway, so you can look at scaling laws for quantities like these. So there are, I mean, if you get deep into some, if you get deep into some subject, you'll always find something that has to be done there, something that is lacking. So you can always do something with the data that you have. Okay. The third thing that I wanted to, is this clear? I mean, I'm moving on. So before that,
Yeah, let's move on.
yeah. Okay. So the third paper I had selected yesterday was this one. See, the Lagrangian and Eulerian data set of the wake downstream of a smooth cylinder at a Reynolds number of 3900. So this paper is not actually addressing any physics yet. They have actually just presented about the data set. So they say that there is a new data set available, this one, and the data set has the Eulerian and Lagrangian data for simulations behind a smooth cylinder. Okay, I mean um, so this data set is relevant in particle tracking studies. So if you want to do some particle tracking studies and see if you have some ideas related to that, you can use this data set as it is. However, there is another paper which is related to this one. Okay, anyways, let's complete this one. So the data set description is given again. So this data set is for flow around a cylinder. So there are three domains here. There is the main domain, which is 20 by 20 times the diameter of the cylinder, and there is an Eulerian data set which stores Eulerian velocity field every 10 every 10 time steps. Okay, so every 10 time steps they are storing the Eulerian data here, Eulerian and Lagrangian for both. So this is 10 time steps, and there is a smaller subdomain 2, for which they are storing data at all time steps. So they are not skipping anything. So they're choosing a smaller domain because the data requirements become very high. And for the larger domain, they are using a coarser time resolution. Okay. They have also quantified the the trajectories, the particle trajectories they got for these two subdomains. I mean, they have lost some temporal data here on the coarser resolution thing. So they have compared and calculated the errors between these two and see shown that it really, as long as you're looking at large scale trajectories, those that error wouldn't matter. So they have quantified the error as well. And they have suggested that if you require adequate very accurate trajectories, you should use the data from subdomain 2. The data from subdomain 1 are better suited for studies focusing on large scale motions. Okay, these are the error plots. They've also described the format in which the data is stored, so it's only the text format. Okay, it tells you which variable it is, which domain it is, and the time step. And this entire data set is available on this website here. This website. So let's go to that website now. Okay, so this is the website. All the data files are they are available as in a zip folder. They are very heavy data files. I mean, if you actually figure out something that you can want to do with these Lagrangian particle paths, then this might be very useful. So I just came across this yesterday and have been exploring it since. Uh, you know, there is a related publication called Lagrangian coherent track initiation. So we'll also look at this one, what this is about. But first, we'll go to this website, 4DPTV. Since we are talking about particle tracking, we'll look at what options are there. So, 4DPTV is basically particle tracking velocimetry. I think it is used extensively by people who do PIVs. So they have these uh, or so yeah. Okay, I do not have pen here. Okay, so when you do PIV, you have your snapshots, you have your particles seeded like in the image here. So all these bright spots that you see are actually particles that were seeded in the flow, and they move along with the flow. And the way you actually measure the particle velocities is you take snapshots, uh, and then get their velocities from consecutive snapshots. Okay, so this 4D PTV module is primarily for PIVs, but I think it's meant for volumetric PIVs because mm, all the methods that have been described here, they require multiple cameras from different angles. Okay, so what they do is uh, in the tunnel test section, they have some flow here. Okay, so they have multiple cameras pointed at the flow. Okay, so at least three. So some of the codes that are given there, they say that you need at least three cameras. So from these three or higher number of cameras, you take snapshots, and then you reconstruct these images into a three-dimensional, field. So you have your particle images and locations in a three-dimensional field. Okay, so and then you track that in time to get those particle trajectories in a three-dimensional flow. Okay, so these methods are for three-dimensional particle tracking, uh, velocimetry. So this usually involves four steps. The first one is to uh, construct the particles from all those three cameras. So they use a triangulation procedure um, to get those particles locations, and then there is something called track initiation. So uh, they take in this they take several time frames, all those four snapshots, and they calculate the optimum track which will be optimal. I mean, there can be several tracks possible within the and then they predict the path of those particles. Okay, so there is this track initiation step, which is what this paper is about, the one that they have. Just a minute. Okay, the one that they have referred to here. So uh, I mean, there is a lecture on this talk on this paper here as well. So this you can also attend this talk, and there is a paper related to that. So you can also go through this one for if you want to know what this is in greater detail. So this talks about the path initiation methods, track initiation methods. So there have been several methods to initiate these tracks. Uh, okay, it might be there in the paper itself. Okay, so this paper talks about Lagrangian coherent track initiation. So usually track initiation codes, what they do is if you want to initiate a track for a given particle, you also look at the track of the neighboring particles, and if you find that there is you know if there is a correlation between these tracks, you keep those tracks, and if you do not find any significant correlation, you drop those tracks, like shown in the example here. You see there is so this particle, so these neighboring particles actually flow this manner. So it's taking this track as the optimum, and it's rejecting this one. However, what this paper says is that you should look at the Lagrangian coherent structures as well before selecting the particles. I mean, if you have two vertical motions, uh, like there are two motions. Let's use this figure itself. So the motion of this particle, these particles, and this one may not be related. So this and the motion of this and this particle might not be related. So before you select the particles for track initiation, you should look whether they are part of a given coherent structure or not. So what it does, it identifies a coherent Lagrangian coherent structure, to be precise, and then it uses the track initiation pattern. Okay, so they detect the Lagrangian coherent structures in this thing using the finite time Lyapunov experiment. So these are quite technical terms, but should not you know get scared of these, and should actually explore this. Let me tell you briefly what a Lagrangian coherent structure would be. So we have talked about coherent structures, right? So I told you that these are basically eddying motions, or any extended region in space where we will find significant correlation between uh, quantities like velocities or temperature or something. So in an Eulerian framework, if you have a region of correlation, then that is a coherent structure. Like streaks were there. So these were regions of spatial regions where the velocities were low. Okay, but these are defined in an Eulerian way. So these are Eulerian velocities. We had defined the hairpin mm, hairpin vortex. So these are again identified using Eulerian quantities. Like if you derive the entropy from the Eulerian velocities and apply a threshold on this, then you might identify these structures. Okay, so these are Eulerian constructs. So in a similar way, you people actually um, identify Lagrangian coherent structures based on the Lagrangian path of particles. So there are Lagrangian coherent structures, and these actually what these do is they actually refer to the particle paths. Okay, so let's say you have a cluster of particles here. So these particles can all move together. So what's happening here is their motion is correlated. Okay, so this region would be a coherent structure. Uh, Uh, Eventually, what could also happen is all these particles are moving away from each other. So they are all moving away, or they all might move towards each other. So there is a correlated motion between all these particles. So these are coherent structures. So there you can also classify these coherent structures as attracting coherent and repelling coherent structures based on how these velocities are moving. And finite time Lyapunov exponent is one of the ways to identify this coherent structure. Okay. So what this exponent does is it basically identifies the converging and diverging, attracting and repelling coherent structures, okay, through some coefficient that is evaluated. So okay, so, okay, you can get into the details of how it is evaluated later, but okay, once these structures are identified, they tag these particles, and then they initiate the uh, tracks of those particles. Likewise, uh, so they use Lagrangian coherent structures to initiate the tracking. Okay, now these methods are used for PIVs. I mean, they can also be used for some synthetic data like DNS data. So what they have done is they have used a DNS data to evaluate the how the method works. Okay, so the data that they have used is the data set, is this data set that they reported earlier in a paper in this paper. Okay, so they have evaluated the effects of particle concentration, the temporal scale, and noise ratio on their algorithm, particle tracking algorithm. So obviously, why the particle concentration is important is because in your there are several processes like you have your particle reconstruction is there, your track initiation is there, your prediction and optimization is there. So in these processes, what happens is your identified particles, some of your identified particles might drop. Okay, so you need enough particle concentration that your you should have those particle paths, or else it will not work properly. Also, the scales that you would be able to resolve would depend on particle concentration as well. Okay, so this plot here shows the scales resolved with the particle concentration. Okay, so D here is the integral length scale. So if you use, let's say, 2000 particles in the domain that they have selected, so they are able to resolve only these many scales. Using 20,000 particles, they are also able to resolve the inertial range scales. If they use 200,000 particles, they get closer to the Kolmogorov scales, but they can increase the unresolved and increase the resolved scales that are there in flow. So by increasing particle concentration, they have increased uh, the spatial scales resolved. Then they have also studied the effect of temporal scale. I mean, dt by dns. I mean the time step for your particle tracking, and dt dns is your uh, the time step for dns. And they are so what they have done is they compared the time step required with Reynolds number for the three cases. They also had another plot here. Okay, they had another part, but it's not here now. Okay, yeah, this one. So here they show that these are for three noise ratios. First thing is, as you increase your DT, the errors are increasing. So this axis is how much percentage resemblance is there with the two tracks. So you see that resemblance reduces as the DT increases. So if the time step used is larger, then you'll have a larger error. Again, for you have seeded more number of particles, but also the noise might have increased here. This is just with particles. Okay, so with a larger number of particles, this goes further away from these two tracks. And if you go even higher, the drop is almost linear here. Okay, so anyways, so this paper is about the track initiation method, uh, and the particle, how the this new track initiation method that they have recommended performs. So this was it. I mean, I could only go through these two papers, um, the time that I had. Uh, so I think that would be it for me for today. So what I would like to do is I would like to explore these particle tracking methods. So there are open source codes here. Okay, you can explore these codes and see if any of them can be used by you. So these, in conjunction with the data set that we had seen, we can actually do some particle tracking studies for various flows. Okay, so this is like I focused on particle tracking because this is something that I have to do in future. So I found this interesting and I would like to explore this further. So what I was thinking is, let's stop the class here today. Uh, Hello.
Okay.
I would. So there are two of you. So I would assign. So I wanted to make three projects, um, and assign them in groups. But what I'll do is I'll give two to you guys, and one on this particle tracking thing. I'll do it myself, and we'll present it. Let's say the coming Friday.
In the coming Friday. Okay. Actually, only I am here.
Sorry. Yeah, yeah. Okay, it's okay. I can talk to Mujir later.
Okay.
Uh,
Next
so
Friday I'll be in ISC only. Will I
that's
be meeting you in college?
yeah, you'll meet me, but that's okay. I mean, what I'm saying is, for this course, we can we do this by next Friday?
Yeah.
Like, it's not like you have to do something substantial, but you have to make an attempt and show what you did.
Okay.
What was your thought process? What were you trying to do? All these things. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So let's stop today. We'll work on these projects. I'll send you the project that you would have to do by. I'll upload these on Teams. Okay, I'll upload these
Okay.
three projects. You can choose whichever you want to do.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye bye.
Bye bye.